On March the 7th, 1942, my mother, my brother, and myself left Brussels for France. And at the Belgian-French border in Lille, this man boarded the train. And we had false identity papers. We had Belgian names. I don't very much recall the names we had. And he traveled with us to the border town on the demarcation line, which was called La Rochefoucauld, in the province of Charente in France. And he told us to go into one of those small hotels, and that in the morning at 6 o'clock, the next morning at 6 o'clock, he would take us across the unmarked border. It was an open field. There was no border. It was an open field. He told us, you will have to run for a little while and you'll be across, but I'll tell you where to cross. So at 7 o'clock in the morning, we met him in front of a cafe, and he marched us to the open field and said, okay, this is where I leave you. You just walk, and over there where you see the trees, you'll be in the clear. We started to march, and it took maybe 2 minutes when we heard Germans scream behind us, halt, nicht weitergehen, do not continue. Oder wir schießen, or we shoot. We turned around and we saw this was the German Feldgendarmerie, called German gendarmes, the police, border police. We turned and saw them with their guns. We had no choice. My brother was, at that time, 12 years old. So we stopped. They took us to the town, to La Rochefoucauld, to the police station, German police station, and interrogated us. And they asked us questions in German, which we did not answer. We always said we couldn't understand. And finally, somehow or other, these interrogators were not particularly dumb. They knew with whom they were dealing. And they even said to me, we can see, I mean, here was a girl, 16 years old. We can see in your eyes that you understand the German questions. I will never forget that. It taught me a lot. And so then they tried to make polite conversation. One of the SS superiors there tried to tell us, which was a typical maneuver, that he knew a lot about Judaism. He had seen the Shabbat evening, the Onyx Shabbat traditional lighting of the candles. He told us all that because that's how they wanted people to become more familiar and start talking, which we did not. So then they told us that the next morning we would be brought to the prison in the city of Angoulême. We were brought to the prison after we had been separated from my brother, who was taken from us and who was put up with a French family by the Germans. We arrived in the prison, which was run by both Germans and French. And in this prison, we found out that our case was not unusual, that we had been caught by the Germans, because people who were in that prison knew that there were what they called passeurs, the smugglers, that they just sold us out to the Germans. which then became obvious to us. Because why were they there 2 minutes afterwards?
So these people, they took money from you, and then they took money from the Germans
Obviously,
to report you.
that's right. That's what we found out in the prison. And then in April, we were told that we were going to be transported from the prison to a big assembly camp in the town of Poitiers, also in Charente. That is where we were brought together again with my brother. This camp was run exclusively by Vichy France, by the French. You couldn't talk to these people. You couldn't induce them to do anything for you. They were already part of General Pétain's Vichy. So there we lived in barracks, the families together, and nobody knew what was going to happen. All we did was some kitchen detail, which we would call it in the army, and we tried to learn from other people, have instituted certain courses, and just to keep ourselves alive. And the conditions were not very good because food was becoming more scarce, and the whole atmosphere was rather tense. We had no idea what was going to come, because this was May 1942. And then time passed, and comes July 16th, it was my brother's 13th birthday. And we had tried to have him be bar mitzvah in the camp. And I had studied with him and read a little bit the Torah excerpts, the parshas with him. But on July the 17th, one day after his birthday, the order came. All men and women between the ages of 18 to 45 were leaving the camp on the 17th. Old people and children stay behind. And we were told, as all over Europe, that we were going to Russia, to the Ukraine, to work for the Germans. And I will never forget my mother, who did not speak Russian but understood it perfectly because her parents spoke Russian. She said to me, "If we are going to Russia, don't worry, I'll be able to get us through." I'll never forget it, because she felt she could communicate. So we were shipped out that morning. We left my brother behind. And we were shipped to another assembly camp in the city of Angers. But that was like an enormous, I don't know whether it was a castle or some sort of a very old building, where we were jammed together into small rooms, like 20, 30 people sleeping on the stone floors.
Now, were you still together with your mother at
I
this
was
point?
with my mother. And the next morning, we were all brought into the big assembly place, where we were told there were the Germans already. And we saw freight trains. And the Germans told us, whatever you possess, everything has to be thrown into the middle of a big bonfire. Papers, pencils, whatever you have. You can have your handbag with you, you can keep that, but everything that's in it, forget about it. Everything had to go. At that point, my mother saw a French gendarme. And she was a very charming woman, and she thought that she could convince him to give him some money and get us out of there. Of course, no way. He wouldn't think of it. So then came the moment where we were told, everybody on those freight trains. And we went in, and we were, I don't know how many people we were in the wagons. The doors closed, and we were crammed together. Somebody was sitting, somebody was standing. There was a big can in the middle of the wagon, and we started to roll. Nobody had any idea. Later on, of course, people knew, but in July 1942, this is the time when the big, what was called razzias, the big gathering of Jews in France started during those days. There were already 2 or 3 transports before us, but which we found out later, but we were one of the first transports out of France. So we traveled. We had no idea where we were. You couldn't look out. So it took maybe 4 days, 3 days, 4 days. And then finally the train stopped. It was late afternoon. And then somehow somebody broke a slat in the train, and we could look through. And this is one of the pictures left in my mind, indelible. It was like seeing an absolute desert, only a gray desert. There was nothing. It was desolate. We saw nothing, just desolate. And we didn't know where we were. And my mother always said, we couldn't be in Russia. No way. This is not far enough. But where were we? And then finally the doors opened and the screaming and the yelling started. And we saw SS, and we saw people in striped uniforms, no idea who they were. And we were pushed down, and the dogs were barking, and the screaming started. And some people were separated from us, but most of us remained together. We were all no more than 45 years old, but they still looked at people to see who was fit and who wasn't fit. Whatever you had on your shoulder or in your hand was ripped off from you, and of course the famous story, it'll be brought to you. And then they started to beat up people. They started to push the people, and the screaming went even louder, and they said, march, we are going to march, and you better march running. And we ran. And I would think that at that time already we were like anesthetized. We had no idea what happened to us. And we arrived at an entrance, the now famous entrance, Arbeit macht frei, and we saw a few barracks with flowers planted around them. And then we saw many, which we thought were men, standing, no hair, in certain type of brownish uniforms, jumpsuits it looked. People with glazed over eyes, in terrible condition. We had no idea. Later on, we found out that these were the uniforms of Russian soldiers. These were women wearing uniforms of Russian soldiers who had been gassed before. So we were brought into a stone building, told, by that time it was late at night, told to lie down on the floor, and that the next morning we would be processed. So we slept on the floor, on the stone floor. 4 o'clock, they came for us and made us stand in line, the famous appel. We were so reduced to nothing at that point already, because we didn't even know where we were. But by that time, at 4 o'clock in the morning, there were other women prisoners there in their striped uniforms, and who told us where we were in a mocking, very mocking voice, saying, you come here and you won't come out of here, because you will go through the chimney. The chimney? What are they talking